Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 09, Episode 12. Today we delved into Chapter 12 of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History, 5th edition, to explore how the hopeful promise of a new era of peace after the Cold War morphed into a period defined by global terrorism, intervention, and widespread unrest. You might remember that euphoric moment in 1991 when the Cold War ended. The USA stood as the sole superpower, brimming with confidence, and the world seemed poised for an era of peace and democracy. Some, like Francis Fukuyama, even suggested we'd reached the end of history itself.
Yeah, the prevailing belief was that, modern liberal democracy and market-oriented capitalism represented the pinnacle, the final form almost.
Exactly.
But what's truly striking here is the immediate disconnect. While the USA envisioned itself as this benevolent world leader ready to guide everyone towards democracy and prosperity, a significant portion of the world just didn't see it that way at all. This gap between the American expectation and global reality, it wasn't minor. It really laid the groundwork for a very different, much more chaotic New World Order.
Okay, let's unpack this initial optimism then.
Yeah.
The textbook highlights American spokesmen, post-Cold War, talking passionately about international justice, liberty, human rights, eradicating poverty, spreading education and health. David Rothkopf even declared in '97 that the U.S. was the most just, the most tolerant, and the best model for the future. Pretty bold stuff.
Very bold. But it absolutely begs the question, if that was the stated vision, how did it sour so badly? How did it lead to such widespread resentment, even hatred, driving people to commit, horrific acts of terrorism?
Yeah.
The source points directly to millions around the world who just weren't part of that prosperous American lifestyle. They saw little evidence, of genuine U.S. efforts to close the gap between rich and poor, or to really fight for universal justice. It led to deep disillusionment.
And this connects directly to what Nicholas Guyot warned about in his 2000 book, Another American Century. He saw this growing frustration with U.S. complacency and impenetrability. He suggested that, without real political solutions, many could be pushed towards radical and extreme measures. His conclusion was pretty stark. As long as the U.S. remained insulated from the effects of its actions, it would have little sense of the true desperation they produce in others.
That's a really critical observation. So what were these actions fueling the desperation? The textbook points to a whole mix of U.S. policies. One major thread was continued interventionism.
Right, even without the Cold War justification.
Exactly. The U.S. didn't exactly step back from military action. You have the 1989 invasion of Panama, for instance, to arrest Manuel Noriega. Tragically, that resulted in maybe 2,000 civilian deaths.
Wow.
And the Organization of American States voted 20-1 against the U.S. on that. The U.S. was the one. Then there were interventions in Latin America, the bombing of Serbia in 1999. Some critics, like William Blum, saw that as blocking the expansion of the American empire.
But then the flip side was also true, wasn't it? Criticism for failure to intervene.
Yes, absolutely. A terrible example is the 1994 Rwanda genocide. 500,000 people massacred. The U.S. was reluctant to get fully involved, citing no direct interests, the high cost. Nicholas Guy called that atrophying the cause of peacekeeping. Another huge flashpoint was the Arab-Israeli conflict. The perception of clear U.S. siding with Israel, President Bush refusing to deal with Yasser Arafat, that fostered real bitterness in the Arab and Muslim world.
Then what about international law? You mentioned Reagan earlier.
Right. So a third point was this perceived disregard for international law and bodies like the UN. Reagan talks up international law in '84, but the very next day rejects an International Court of Justice ruling against the U.S. mining Nicaraguan harbors, refused to pay compensation.
Doesn't sound very supportive of international order.
Well, Noam Chomsky observed that when the UN fails to serve as an instrument of American unilateralism, it is dismissed. It fed this idea that the U.S. played by its own rules.
And that unilateral approach seemed to continue, maybe even accelerate.
It did, especially post 9/11 under George W. Bush, with these unilateral policy shifts. Even before the attacks, he'd rejected the '72 anti-ballistic missile treaty, pulled out of the Kyoto Climate Accords, cut off talks with North Korea. It signaled a definite turn inward or perhaps outward on its own terms.
Okay, so intervention, non-intervention, international law, unilateralism, anything else?
Yes. The massive economic power of the U.S. decisions in Washington, they rippled globally. The U.S. had firm control over the World Bank, the IMF, making sure loan conditions suited U.S. interests often meant strict austerity for borrowing countries. Will Hutton argued the whole system was shaped more for U.S. power than the world public good. By late 2002, people were calling it an imperial grand strategy.
So all these factors, actions, inactions, perceptions, they kind of brewed this potent cocktail of global resentment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And this simmering discontent, it leads us right into the rise of global terrorism. But maybe first, let's clarify. What exactly is terrorism, according to the sources?
Okay, Ken Booth and Tim Dunn define it as a method of political action that uses violence or deliberately produces fear against civilians and against civilian infrastructure in order to influence behavior, to inflict punishment, or to exact revenge.
A method of political action. That's key.
It is, but the definition itself, or rather the application of the label, is complex. It often depends on your perspective, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, take Nelson Mandela. Labeled a terrorist by the apartheid government in South Africa for decades, now widely seen as a freedom fighter. Or Yasser Arafat Bush wouldn't meet him, called him a terrorist. But similar Israeli actions might be called legitimate.
So it depends which side you're on and which side wins in the end, as the source says.
Exactly. It's a heavily loaded term.
Looking at the history then, initially terrorism was more localized, right? Like ETA in Spain, the IRA in Ireland.
That's right. Focus on specific regions, specific national goals. But things started to go global in the 70s. The Munich Olympics in '72, the attack on Israeli athletes, that was a major shift.
And then the U.S. became the primary target.
Increasingly so, especially from the 1980s onwards. You see this grim pattern. The '83 Beirut embassy bombing, the '88 Lockerbie bombing of a Pan Am flight, the first World Trade Center attack in '93, the '98 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and the USS Cole attack in 2000. An American destroyer hit in port. The message seemed pretty clear: we do not want you here.
And the sources name some key groups driving this.
Yes, the Abu Nidal organization, a PLO splinter group. Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, based in Lebanon, linked to the Beirut embassy attack, taking Western hostages. And Hamas, formed in '87, aiming for an Islamic Palestinian state known for, tragically, suicide bombings against Israeli targets.
Then Al-Qaeda.
Right. Probably the most infamous group of that era. What's fascinating and deeply ironic is its origin story.
Go on.
Al-Qaeda formed in the late '80s during the Afghan war against the Soviets, and who funded and trained many of those fighters?
The U.S. and its allies.
Exactly, as part of the Cold War strategy. But after the Soviets left, Al-Qaeda, under Osama bin Laden, turned its focus. They wanted Islamic governments, and they specifically targeted the Saudi regime, which they saw as non-religious and propped up by the U.S.
So bin Laden's goals were?
Pretty clear, according to the source. Get U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia, overthrow the Saudi government, get a settlement for Palestine, and, critically, provoke a huge confrontation between Islam and the West, hoping to unite the Muslim world against what he saw as foreign influence and humiliation. He actually thought a massive U.S. overreaction would work in his favor.
Which brings us, tragically, to September 11th, 2001.
Yes, an absolutely horrific day, 4 hijacked planes, the World Trade Center towers collapsing, the Pentagon hit, another plane down in Pennsylvania. Around 2,800 killed in New York alone, hundreds more at the Pentagon and on the planes, victims from over 40 countries.
Right.
Just unimaginable.
The deadliest attack ever on U.S. soil.
Yeah.
And the response was immediate.
Instantaneous. President Bush declared a war on terrorism. The initial aims: overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan for harboring al-Qaeda and destroy al-Qaeda itself. But he also broadened it, threatening any regime that encouraged terrorists. He famously named Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as an axis of evil. That caused quite a bit of international alarm. People like German Chancellor Schroeder worried it sounded like a war against Islam itself.
It's interesting, though, the source provides some nuance on the Taliban regime itself.
Yeah.
Not just a monolithic evil.
That's right. They emerged from the chaos after the Soviets left Afghanistan in '89. And yes, they were condemned internationally for horrific policies, treatment of women, harsh punishments, destroying historical sites like the Buddha statues. Absolutely. But the source also notes they had some initial success, according to some observers like James Ferguson, a British journalist. Things like reducing corruption, making roads safer. Ferguson argued that they were never as uniformly wicked as they were routinely made out to be. It's a complex picture.
But they were harboring al-Qaeda.
Undeniably. And they were quickly overthrown by U.S. and U.K. forces in October 2001. But bin Laden escaped. The war on terror in Afghanistan didn't end there. NATO troops came in, supported a new government, but the Taliban regrouped. By 2012, it was still an ongoing insurgency, basically a civil war.
And bin Laden, he continued issuing these fatwas, these religious edicts.
Yes, framing it as this grand struggle between Islam and the West, calling on Muslims to resist perceived Western exploitation.
Until he was finally found and killed in Pakistan in May 2011.
Right. which brought mixed reactions. Celebrations in the U.S., sure, but also fears of reprisal attacks. A Hamas leader called him an Arab holy warrior. It didn't neatly end anything.
And the axis of evil speech. That focus quickly shifted towards Iraq, didn't it?
It did. After the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was still in power. He'd brutally crushed rebellions. The UN believed he still had some WMD programs, though the IAEA confirmed his nuclear facilities were destroyed by '98.
But the sanctions were having a devastating effect.
Immense suffering for ordinary Iraqis. UNICEF reported maybe 500,000 child deaths by '99 due to malnutrition, lack of medicine. A terrible humanitarian crisis unfolding under the sanctions regime.
Yet, President Bush began pushing hard for regime change in Iraq. What were the justifications given?
Several, and they were alarming. Saddam's supposed WMD stockpile, alleged links to al-Qaeda after 9/11. The argument that waiting would only increase the danger, some even drew parallels to Hitler in the 1930s.
But there was huge opposition to this, wasn't there?
Massive opposition, internationally and within intelligence communities. Critics argued the WMD threat was wildly exaggerated. Scott Ritter, the chief UN inspector, said 90–95% were gone by '98.
Right.
And the links to al-Qaeda or 9/11. Congressional reports later found insufficient evidence. Many suspected the real motives were more about U.S. global dominance, controlling oil. A 1998 Republican document had already advocated removing Saddam for U.S. interests.
So the UN Security Council demanded Iraq disarm with Resolution 1441. Inspectors went back in.
And reported Iraqi cooperation was improving, though not perfect. But the U.S. and U.K. weren't satisfied. When France threatened to veto a resolution authorizing force,
They went ahead anyway.
they did. The U.S., U.K., Spain, and a few others invaded in March 2003. The historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote the U.S. was adopting a policy alarmingly similar to Pearl Harbor, turning post-9/11 sympathy into global hatred of American arrogance and militarism. Strong words.
The invasion itself, how did that go?
Slower than expected initially, with more resistance. And civilian casualties were high, maybe 15,000 Iraqis killed in the first month, 5,000 of them civilians. International reaction was mostly negative, viewing it as empire building.
Saddam fell in April 2003. Bush declared mission accomplished on May 1st. But that wasn't the end, was it?
Far from it. Crucially, no WMD were ever found.
The core justification.
Gone. Then came the bombshell revelation from Paul O'Neill, the former Treasury Secretary, in early 2004. He said Bush was determined to oust Saddam from the very start of his presidency, January 2001, and 9/11 just provided a convenient justification. He claimed the cabinet knew Saddam likely didn't have significant WMD.
That's astounding.
It completely undermined the stated reasons for war. Iraqi resentment soared, fueled by insensitive occupation tactics, lack of clear plans. Armed resistance exploded. First, Saddam loyalists, then nationalists, Sunni Muslims wanting an Islamic State, and foreign militants flooded in.
So al-Qaeda did become active in Iraq just after the invasion.
Precisely. The invasion arguably created the very conditions for al-Qaeda to thrive there.
And the consequences spread far beyond Iraq.
Absolutely. Al-Qaeda was arguably strengthened globally. New networks popped up in Europe. We saw those terrible attacks. Bali, Jakarta, Istanbul, Madrid.
The Madrid train bombings in 2004 actually changed the government there, didn't they?
They did. The new Spanish PM promptly pulled their troops out of Iraq. And then London, July 2005, the bus and tube bombings.
Meanwhile, Iraq itself remained incredibly unstable.
Deeply unstable. Calls grew for the U.S. and U.K. to leave, for a UN administration. Concerns mounted over human rights abuses by U.S. troops, torture, Guantanamo Bay transfers, all feeding anti-Americanism. Sectarian violence spiraled. The economy became totally dependent on oil. A real mess.
Okay, so Afghanistan, Iraq, and then came another wave of upheaval, the Arab Spring, starting in late 2010.
That's right. It kicked off in Tunisia, December 2010. A young graduate, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire out of frustration over unemployment, lack of opportunity. It sparked mass protests.
And incredibly quickly, President Ben Ali was overthrown after 23 years.
Astonishing speed. And it spread like wildfire. Egypt was next. Hosni Mubarak, 30 years in power, forced out in February 2011.
What were the underlying causes driving all this?
A common set of grievances across the region. Lack of democracy, massive corruption, huge wealth gaps, human rights abuses, and importantly, a large educated young population with no jobs and soaring food prices. And ironically, many of these regimes were pro-Western dictatorships the U.S. had supported.
In Egypt, the Tahrir Square protests became iconic.
Yes, initially met with crackdowns with the sheer number of people forced to Mubarak out, but it remained complex. The military held on to a lot of power. Tensions rose, attacks on Coptic Christians, the Muslim Brotherhood won elections, but the military still controlled the constitution process. Very turbulent.
Libya's Arab Spring turned violent very quickly.
Extremely violent. Colonel Gaddafi, 42 years in power, he'd brought modernization with oil money, yes, but faced criticism internally and externally, WMD programs, supporting militants. Though, paradoxically, he'd actually improved ties with the West after the Cold War, even shared intel with the CIA.
But when protests started in Benghazi in February 2011,
He responded with brutal force, hundreds killed. That sparked a full-blown civil war. And then NATO intervened based on a UN resolution to protect civilians.
another controversial intervention.
It's highly controversial. The West hailed it as a victory for democracy. But others, including some countries, argued NATO went way beyond protecting civilians and just pursued regime change. Gaddafi apparently offered ceasefires, but they were rejected.
The human cost was enormous.
An estimated 30,000 dead, massive destruction. And concerns grew about Islamist factions, like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, gaining power after Gaddafi fell.
What about Saudi Arabia? Did the Arab Spring reach there?
There were some protests, mainly from the Shia minority, but King Abdullah, with the kingdom's immense oil wealth, acted fast. He rolled out this huge multi-billion-pound reform package, jobs, wage rises, housing.
Buying off dissent, essentially.
You could see it that way.
Yeah.
He also made some limited reforms for women, letting them vote in municipal elections from 2015, serve on the Advisory Shura Council. But the driving ban, a major symbol, remained.
Okay, one last major player in the region mentioned is Iran.
Yes, Iran. A complex relationship with the West ever since the '79 Islamic Revolution. The source notes leaders like Rafsanjani and Khatami tried some liberalization, but hardliners and economic problems held them back. Then came Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
A fierce nationalist.
Very much so. And he made Iran's nuclear program this huge symbol of national pride, an icon of patriotism.
Iran had nuclear tech before the revolution, though, right? The Shah started it.
They did, insisting it was peaceful. But after '79, under sanctions, they secretly pushed ahead with weapons development. David Patrikarakos, in his book Nuclear Iran, suggests they felt they had reason to want a bomb feeling isolated, especially after the world's silence during the Iran-Iraq War.
That makes sense from their perspective.
It likely fueled the drive. By 2002, Western alarm bells were ringing loudly about uranium enrichment, demands to stop. Iran refused. Tensions shot up, threats of military strikes from the U.S., Israel. Iran threatened to cut oil exports.
Causing panic.
Exactly. By 2012, the situation was still incredibly tense. Russia and China were backing Iran, questioning Western motives, suggesting the real goal was just overthrowing the Islamic Republic again. Still a powder keg.
So wrapping this up,
Yeah.
it's starkly clear that the hopeful dawn after the Cold War just didn't last. That promise of peace. It morphed into something far darker. Shifting power, globalized terror, controversial interventions.
Yeah, and a huge gap in perception between how the U.S. saw its role and how much of the world experienced it.
Absolutely. In 2012, where the source leaves off, the New World Order looked anything but settled. Afghanistan still in conflict, Iraq fractured, the Arab Spring states in precarious transitions.
That's right. And it really raises that fundamental question, doesn't it? James Ferguson hinted at dialogue being the only way forward in Afghanistan. Is that the key? Can the West, can everyone learn to approach these deep-seated conflicts with a genuinely different understanding, moving beyond just intervention or condemnation?
A crucial question.
Yeah.
And the legacy of this turbulent period is still very much with us today. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.